I first started writing about film when I was in my second year of university, and I started pitching to a blog. I saw somebody was looking for some writing on film. I saw it on Twitter, and I really wanted to do it. I hadn't thought about it before, but I'd always watched films and kind of thought about them in depth. So I just flash wrote a review and submitted it to them, and it all sort of came from there. And so I was writing this blog, and then I got brought on as an editor. Obviously, this is all recreational writing, and then slowly but surely I began to meet editors and began to pitch for real, and then I just started freelancing.
And what to you, this is a very broad question, but what to you is film criticism? Like, could you give a kind of definition of what you think film criticism is, what it's supposed to do, what its point and its value is?
Film criticism is writing about film with a critical lens. It's not just offering an opinion, it's offering an informed opinion. And I think it was Derek Malcolm who said that the job of a film critic is to introduce people to films that they wouldn't normally see. So kind of trying to broaden the scope of film culture, but, in quite a low-key way sometimes.
Do you see there being a difference between a film critic and a film reviewer? And if you do think there's a difference, with which do you ally yourself personally?
I think there is a difference between a film critic and a film reviewer. I think a film reviewer, it doesn't sound serious, it doesn't sound like there's any rigour behind it. Anyone could be a reviewer of anything, whereas a critic implies a sort of informed opinion, and I definitely would see myself more as a critic than a reviewer, but really I don't see myself as either. I see myself as a writer and a journalist, and that's how I approach film.
But you don't have any discomfort with the term critic, because a lot of people see it as a kind of privileged term or an elite term, and that's you don't have that hesitation about it. You're quite happy to be labelled a critic, even if that's not the label that you yourself would use.
I guess so, and it's interesting that you use the word privilege, because yes, there is a kind of elitism attached to the idea of being a critic, but also the writers that I read don't just review films, they write essays about films. There are interviews that they read that uncover more about movies, and I definitely, I don't really just read film reviews, it's more film critics that I read.
Okay, so in that case, I guess what you're saying is that you don't think that the evaluative aspect of film writing is the only part or the most important part of film writing. And so what do you think, what are the other parts of writing? What are the other aspects of criticism that you think are important? I mean, by evaluation, I mean saying whether a film is good or bad, basically. If leaving that aside.
Well, for me, I don't really think that writing about film is writing about whether a film is good or bad. I think that's a very reductive way of looking at it. I think it's more about, is this film worth watching? I think that's really what the film critic is trying to drive at. And why should I pay money to see this film? That's why people read film reviews, to know why they should see it. But I think there's a distinction between whether something's good or bad and whether something's interesting enough to watch or pay money to watch.
Do you think there can be valid film criticism directed at a film that is not worth watching, that the writer thinks is not worth watching?
Absolutely. Some of the best reviews I've ever read have been from people who thought the film was terrible and not worth watching, but if they're digging into that in an interesting way, then it's worth reading.
Do you have a particular position on star ratings? I mean, obviously a lot of publications use star ratings.
I do have a position on star ratings, and my position is that I hate them. I think they're stupid, pointless, and I sometimes use the website Letterboxd to sort of track my lists and what I've been watching, and I don't star things on Letterboxd ever. Sometimes I've been in a position where I've had to file a review and I've been asked to give a star rating, and it's better to give it than have somebody else attribute a star rating to your review that doesn't necessarily represent your opinion. But I just find them really reductive, and it doesn't tell you anything about why this film is interesting or good or not good. It doesn't tell you anything about it. It's just...
Do you think that film writing in general would be better without them, or or do you accept? I mean, my understanding is that readers really value star ratings. Readers of, I know there's no such thing as readers in general because we're all individuals, but readers of certainly mainstream publications place great value on the star ratings. In fact, often place far more value on those than on the writing that accompanies them. I mean, I also don't ever put a star rating in if I don't have to, ever, because I'm not particularly fond of them myself. But given that they're, let's say, a necessary evil, is there a way that you can use them to your, can you co-opt them into what is your ideal piece of criticism?
I think that if you have to use a star rating, you can twist that system to your advantage, definitely. So say you saw a film that was, for want of a better word, a 3-star film, and it was good, but you weren't massive on it, but it was a more obscure film or it hadn't been as widely distributed. If you bumped it up to a 4-star rating, more people would go and see it. You're helping that film. That's a kind of activism in a way. I think star ratings, though, can be disingenuous and slippery. And, you know, what do they even mean? What is a 5-star film? How are we defining it? I don't think there's a coherent, consistent definition for that.
Have publications for which you've written made it clear what they require from their star rating systems? Like, have they told you, well, what we mean by a 5-star rating is X or Y, and we would like you to conform to that? Or have you found generally you've been unguided in how you should use them?
You know, I hadn't really thought about it, and no, I don't think I've had guidance on what the star ratings mean.
Well, I'm going to get off star ratings, but I've got one last question about them, just because I'm really interested in this.
No, that's fine.
If you had written a review and you gave 3 stars to this particular film, and your publication, without consulting you, changed the star rating that you had given the film, would this annoy or upset you, or would you not care? Given your position on star ratings.
I think it would depend on both the publication and the film. Say you were doing freelance for somewhere like Cosmopolitan, and I know they've been known to shift star ratings to kind of meet advertising requirements and stuff. Does it really matter? Are you really appealing to those readers if you're being a serious film critic? I don't know. But if it was a film that I cared about and I felt that it would be misrepresented, then yeah, I think I would be annoyed.
Changing over to sort of new media and also the kind of the future of criticism, I guess. I don't know how long have you actually been a critic? How long have you been writing about film? I know you're uncomfortable with the term critic, but
probably about 3 or 4 years. I'm still quite new in the world of film criticism.
Would you say that even within those 3 or 4 years, have you noticed in any way that the landscape has been changing? The landscape in which film criticism is produced or film writing is produced, the media, for example.
A lot of journalists that I read have been sacked or made redundant, and I think the biggest change really is a lot more mainstream and even broadsheet publications are going freelance, which is good for a freelancer like me, but also tricky for anybody who might want to make a career in film criticism.
Would you regard new media, and by new media I guess I mean things like blogs and podcasts and Twitter and aggregators like Rotten Tomatoes and even things like Letterboxd, do you regard these new media as a boon or a bane to film criticism?
I think they're a positive thing, mostly, but one thing that really upsets me, and I noticed it a couple of years ago, and I think maybe the trend has perhaps subsided a little bit, is putting random people's tweets on film posters and using that as criticism or pull quotes. And it could be anyone. It could be the PR team making up these tweets, and I understand that it's a sort of appeal to the everyman, but I think that's not healthy for film criticism. Some of the most interesting conversations I've had about film have taken place on Twitter in the past few years. It's definitely the idea that anybody can write authoritatively about anything. I don't think that's why people seek out film criticism or music criticism or any kind of arts criticism. Everybody has their opinion, but you're looking for a trusted opinion or somebody who has a background in that field to sort of guide you.
And do you think that print is, I mean, you've already sort of hinted at this already, but do you think that print journalism is in its death throes? And can I add a sort of adjunct to that? Does it matter if print dies?
I do think print is becoming less prevalent, and no, I don't think it matters that much. Most people I know that write about film get excited about print publications from a very vain perspective. They like seeing their name in print, and who doesn't? But also I don't think that the quality of print writing is necessarily always better than the quality of online writing, and that really is the important thing to remember when people are lamenting the death of print magazines. You don't have to go there to seek out interesting, informed writing.
What future do you see for the professional film critic? And by professional film critic, I mean paid film critic. I mean professional in a very, very precise sense. I'm not talking about the quality of the writing, but just about the fact that film critics are paid.
I think as long as journalism continues to thrive and, editorial voices exist to kind of shape their writers and kind of, have a standard to set, I think that people will continue to be paid for their writing. But I don't know whether people are going to be reading that versus reading unpaid. I don't think, sometimes it's not always easy to make a distinction between what's quote unquote professional or not professional. And so from a reader perspective, I think that's a really tricky thing to answer. But I think as long as there's money and there's people in journalism, I think, writers will get paid.
And I think possibly you've answered the question I'm about to ask, but do you think that the views of a professional or paid critic should be valued more than those of an amateur?
Yes and no. I think, for me, I think for somebody who is unpaid, there comes a time where it stops being a hobby and it starts being work, or vice versa, it stops being work and it starts being a hobby. And I think work should be compensated. So, I think people who are being paid to do it, I think that's important. And people who are very good, who aren't being paid to do it, should maybe think about venturing into the world of paid freelance, because it exists and a lot of people are comfortable, not having their voice constrained in any way, not having their writing edited. And I think there's value in being paid to write, but also having your writing kind of looked over and tightened.
But you're not of the view that unpaid film writing is somehow, by definition, simply by virtue of the fact that it's unpaid, not of the same quality?
Not by definition, no.
I agree, but the two first really well-known named film critics, like the big names in film criticism in the UK, and this is back in the 20s, I was rather surprised to learn, were both women. And I wonder if you could say how you think the current landscape compares to that landscape some a century ago.
I mean, I'm not that familiar with the short history of film criticism and female critics that were writing in the 20s, so I'm not sure how accurately I can answer this. But I think there are a lot less women writing about film. I think it's a very masculine environment, and as a woman writing about film, sometimes I do feel a bit boxed into the women's issues niche, and a lot of my editors kind of know that I'm interested in this, and might push those kind of stories towards me.
So, for example, are you saying that you would have a woman's title commissioned rather than, let's say, an action film or the latest Marvel blockbuster? Are you saying that there are particular types of projects that are for which you receive commissions simply by virtue of the fact that you're a woman and it's sort of somehow deemed that this is going to be of interest to you as a woman? Or are you talking more about, do you mean more essays on the subject of feminism?
Yeah, more editorial stuff, really.
Right.
Although I know female journalists who write for major publications who get sent to review women's films, which I think is quite shocking. I haven't really had that experience, but I do think that some of the editorial projects that have been pushed my way have been done so because I'm a woman, which is both a good and bad thing, I guess. It's positive in the sense that I'm interested in those issues and it allows me to explore them and have a platform for my voice when it comes to issues of feminism or race, those sorts of things. But sometimes you walk into a screening room and you're the girl and you don't always want to take on that role. So people know you as a feminist or someone who writes about women's film, and really I write about film in general.
Do you think that, I mean, in a sense this is going to sound like I'm just perpetuating the problem that you just raised, but do you think it's important to have your particular perspective on, say, for example, race and ethnicity and on gender, focused upon films where those aren't, in an obvious way, the issues of the films?
Can you
what I mean by that is, there are certain kinds of films where I can see that it's obvious for an editor to assign you to see that film and to give the type of perspective that you were discussing in your last answer. But I'm not thinking about those films at all now. I'm thinking about films where there isn't an obvious, say, focus on women in the film, or there isn't an obvious focus on ethnicity. And do you think that you can bring a particular and important perspective on precisely those films, the films where those things don't play an obvious part, because you're a woman and because of your ethnic background? Do you think that your perspective is still an important and different perspective to have?
I think definitely. My lived experience is as someone who's a woman and as someone who isn't white. So, of course, my personal politics and background are going to feed into my writing no matter what. And I think that it's interesting and enriching to have different voices that aren't necessarily concentrated on issue-based films or articles, because otherwise you just seem to be a mouthpiece for your particular cause, and sometimes sort of non-issue based films benefit from a kind of more rigorous approach. Rigorous is maybe not the right word, but in depth perhaps.
Do you think that, say, female and ethnic voices are excluded from mainstream critical discourse on films? And how might this be changed?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't think of very many black critics that write for mainstream publications. If you think of famous ones, Armand White really is the main one, Wesley Morris. But in terms of sort of serious staff jobs, no, like there aren't many, and there's even less black or brown women. So yeah, I think that it's important for those voices to be heard. I'm not sure it's the critics who necessarily shape film culture, or at least not all by themselves. I think really it's producers and writers and directors who need to be more diverse. It's important that critics are diverse as well, and that we don't have this sort of generic, ubiquitous standard for what's an appealing film or an unappealing film. And by having a diversity of voices, a diversity of films are being highlighted, and that's a positive thing. But in terms of actual change in the films that are being made, I don't know if critics actually do have that much of a role to play.
Okay. And I guess, given that I'm really coming towards the end of my questions, I just want to say, please take this opportunity, if there's anything that you would like to say on the subject of film criticism. I know that's the most open question you've probably ever been asked, so it's very hard to kind of address, but go ahead. It's,
I guess I have a question for you.
Oh boy.
Given that you're a little bit older than I am,
Yeah.
how do you feel about young writers sort of joining the ranks and becoming your competition as a paid freelancer?
Well, I mean, it's terrifying, obviously, but I think the more voices, the better, frankly, and I think that young voices are bringing fresh perspectives, and that has to be a good thing. With age comes a certain amount of experience, but also you're completely closed off from youth culture the older you get, and cinema is aimed primarily at youth, and if you're saying, do I find it threatening for my job? Well, yeah, it is. But I mean, there's diminishing spaces within film criticism anyway, regardless of whether there are more people coming through. There are still fewer jobs than there are people already out there, let alone the new ones coming in. No, I mean, it's a young person's game, and the more the merrier, really. I must say, I kind of like to distinguish between the professional aspect of criticism and the non-professional aspect. We all want to make money, and obviously no one is going to say they don't want to make money. It would be good to make a living out of this. But leaving that aside, I think that the criticism, especially the criticism you see online that is unpaid, there's just so much interesting stuff out there, and stuff that often you'd never find in a print publication.
What sort of unpaid stuff non-professional film writing online do you read? Like, what are the publications that you think are interesting?
Oh boy. Well, I read lots of stuff, so I don't really know. I mean, I often just follow clicks. I read stuff in some of the publications I write for, so I guess I read lots of stuff on iFor Film, and on... Oh, I don't even know how to answer that, to be honest. I read so much that it's
more people that you're sort of following and listening to, or...
Yeah, but I mean, also, that things come to your attention online, and you just follow the threads, and then one thread leads to another. So
yeah,
and I read far more material online than I do in print. I don't read the papers.
Is that a convenience thing, or is that? I think that's why online is ultimately going to win this battle.
Online's won. I don't really think there's any question. For me, the only question is whether online is going to start actually rewarding financially the people that regularly write for it. Because I think the problem that online does have is distinguishing between quality writing and clickbait, and there are obvious distinctions, but those distinctions aren't reflected in the way that payment is produced, and I think that's a problem. But I mean, these things will one way or another.
It's so tricky because a lot of the content that generates money is very PR driven or advertising driven, and that really puts a strain on you as a writer because you're catering to a set kind of agenda that's not necessarily your own. So it's tricky because a lot of the unpaid stuff or unconstrained stuff means that you have more of a free rein to write about what you want without having to worry about PRs.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of married to the idea. I'm never going to make a living out of film writing ever. So in a sense, it would be nice, but this sort of stuff doesn't bother me. I just want to keep writing, and I mostly get paid a little bit for what I write, but I do still write quite a lot for free. But don't tell my colleagues that. And I think that's true of everyone, and most people have a day job, and unless you're Bradshaw or Commode.
Yeah, I feel like I've gotten to the point where I just am not doing it for free anymore. I'm not doing it enough by itself for it to be the only thing that I do, but I just feel that for me, I can't expend that energy without getting a financial compensation for it.